perfect discographies exist, and Bolt Thrower are the living proof of this. And Bolt Thrower are also my favorite death metal band, so I might be a little biased in this video, but there are very few people that actually say that any of their stuff is even subpar. All of it's pretty consistent, pretty similar. That'd maybe be the only main critique, is that sometimes they didn't change their sound that much. But their sound is already so unique that no other death metal band has ever sounded like Bolt Thrower. So ladies and gentlemen, if you want to hear a relentless, extremely consistent, incredibly heavy, amazing death metal band with riffs out the ass, you have found the correct video. However, if your main pastime is looking dried up turds on the pavement, you better get the fuck out of here before I chase you off with a stick. Now, Bolt Thrower was formed in 1986 originally as a heavy thrash and punk band, and it was founded by what would be the two guitarists that have been on every album, Gavin Ward and Barry Thompson. And then they got the drummer for the first bunch of Bolt Thrower albums, Andrew Whale, and a vocalist. His name is Alan West. And it was around this time that Gavin actually switched to guitars instead of playing bass. And then they got this guy named Alex Tweedy, what a stupid name, to play the bass. Then Alex decided to be a lazy fuck and not show up, so Gavin went on to guitars, and he decided to get his girlfriend, Joanne, or as people call her, Jo, bench. Then they recorded a demo that nobody gives a shit about, because I'm not some dumb demo debut dumbass that's going to sit here and talk about demos that are literally just the first album but sound shitty with less songs. But around this time, they actually replaced Alan West with Carl Willits, who would be on all but one Bolt Thrower album. And this guy is easily one of my favorite death metal vocalists ever. And then in 1988, they finally decided to release a fucking album. And this one, oh boy, it's a mammoth. And with that title, they displayed the themes of all albums to come from Bolt Thrower. That every single album would be a wet dream of war and conquest. Now, right away, why the fuck do people consider this a grindcore album? It may be kind of produced like an early grindcore album, but that doesn't mean that the music is somehow grindcore. It's a little different for death metal, but I don't know, to me it just doesn't sound heavy enough. There's not hundreds of songs on here. I don't know, to me it's just a death metal album that was maybe produced to be kind of like grindcore, but it's just shut the fuck up, Bolt Thrower aren't a grindcore band. Now, not only is this one of their most heavy albums, one of their most raw albums, one of the most relentless albums, one of their most short albums, clocking it at 30 minutes or 28 without the bonus track Blind to Defeat, but this album is actually one of their best. A lot of people, including myself, used to consider it actually one of their weaker albums, considering it is just so different. It is their most different album that they've ever released. But man, the more I've heard it, the more I absolutely adore this album. This album is front to back incredible. And I used to find this album to be kind of a jarring listen, but nowadays, for some reason, that's completely changed. Yeah, there's some crazy fast death metal riffage on here that'll reach its apex of chaoticness on the next album. But here they balance it out with some really good catchy riffs, so I just think the whole thing is very, very easily accessible. I find that the album actually gets better as it goes along, though. A lot of the more fast tempo songs that are really crazy are at the beginning, but then once you start getting towards the middle, like Concession of Pain, you get a tempo that's more laid back and some more grooving, easy to get into riffs. But then you get Total World War III on your eardrums, the last three songs, and my favorite is actually the first of the three. My favorite song off the whole album, Attack in the Aftermath. What a fucking song this one is. My recommendation is, if you're one of the many people that consider this one of their weaker albums or their weakest album, or you can't get into it, keep listening to it, because I guarantee you it is a very, very rewarding listen. A very weird album. A lot of the times I don't like to get into debuts that are so different from the rest of their albums, but this one is just as good, if not better, than most of their albums. But they still had something to prove, and they still had somewhere else to go. They still had a lot of evolution and betterment to make to their sound. Bolt Thrower released what many, including myself, consider to be not only their best album, but a fucking apex to the death metal genre. Now the artwork, title, and even name of the band all derives from the game Warhammer 40k, which is a tabletop strategy game. Now this is their first album with Earache, and like every band that has ever signed on to that shitty label, Earache detests them and they detest Earache. This is seriously one of the heaviest death metal albums ever made, which proves that you don't need a horrible, really bassy, or even Scott Burns style production to make the heaviest sounding album. All you need is heavy music and heavy tuning, because I swear they down-tuned to the pits of fucking hell on this album. Which makes the riffs on here even more admirable, because it's really hard to write riffs in such a low tuning, but they somehow succeed in doing so on every single song, writing riffs that are incredibly memorable, incredibly catchy, and utterly badass. What's funny is there's actually a song in here that's really fucking catchy, that has a verse and chorus and everything that's really memorable, and I swear they could have even made this a single. That's right, folks, death metal can be catchy like a fucking pop song. We're talking about the song Dark Millennium. Every single song is around the same quality, even the fucking bonus track that was left off, Prophet of Hatred. But even though everything is around the same quality, there is one true standout, one song that the fan base considers probably their best song on their best album. A song with an absolutely bizarre fucking title that takes forever to get into it. The classic. Then in 1991, Bolt Thrower releases the first album I ever heard from them, an album that I still hold up as one of their absolute best, and another incredible death metal album. That's right, folks, we just keep getting 10 out of 10s. This album sparks the beginning of them stripping down the heaviness a little bit. I still consider it part of that early era because there's still blast beats, the riffs are still very heavy. It's hard to argue otherwise that the first three albums from Bolt Thrower sound like a completely different band than everything after. Everything after sounds like one band, and then everything before sounds like another band. I remember the first time I got into Bolt Thrower, the first time I ever heard this album, I saw a lot of metalhead friends of mine talk about how amazing Bolt Thrower is, how perfect their discography is, and how great this album is. I'm like, no way is there a band with a perfect discography. I'd given up looking for it. It seemed like every great band I'd find there'd be a shitty album, but they were 100% right, and I was so glad that this album would break my Bolt Thrower cherry. And what a fucking way to be introduced to this band through Unleashed Upon Mankind, an epic song that keeps building upon itself. It's almost like in the same vein as the opening tracks in the past two albums. However, what makes it so much better, in my opinion, is the fucking crazy amount of riffs in it. And it just keeps getting better and better and better. It just does not end in the best way. Then we get a ton of really great album tracks, What Dwells Within, The Shreds of Sanity, Profane Creation, a lot of really catchy, great stuff there. Although I'd argue that maybe they're a little bit weaker than, say, some of the songs on the last album. They're still really great songs. But there's one song that I'm kind of like iffy about, and that's Final Revelation, which I find to be kind of a little bit fillerish, but I still think it's a pretty good song. Then there's also the song Cenotaph, which is the sequel to World Eater, which is another classic song. And this one actually had a music video, making it one of Bolt Thrower's most memorable classic songs. But I never really understood the massive hype behind the song. I actually consider it one of the weakest songs in the album. The title track's a really bizarre song, Rebirth of Humanity's awesome, but the coolest fucking song on the whole thing is the last one. A song that has insane riffs on it. One of my favorite Bolt Thrower songs, Afterlife. But like I mentioned before, Bolt Thrower were showing signs of shedding this crazy over-the-top death metal sound, and we're starting to evolve, but in a good way. Because in the next album, Bolt Thrower would simplify things to a bare bones level, but make it good, which very few bands are able to do. Because in 1992, they released what I consider to be if Realm of Chaos didn't exist, probably the best Bolt Thrower album ever. And a huge fan favorite for its very accessible sound. Now right away, probably the weakest thing I gotta say though about this album, even though I love all the songs, and I think it's all extremely well written and extremely catchy, very easy to get into, very easily palatable, that production, god damn, it sounds like a very bad Scott Burns production that sounds like everything's flatlined and dull, but it sounds even more dull than his productions. But I wouldn't say that it ruins anything at all. In fact, on some of the faster songs, it sounds just fine. But it really sticks out like a sore thumb on some of the slower songs, like the first song, the IVth Crusade, which is a classic, instantly draws you in with a very repetitive but very, very memorable riff. Icon's a great fast number. Embers is a weird song because it actually mirrors the intro to Cenotaph, and several other Bolt Thrower songs after this point also do this. Where Next to Conquer is probably my favorite fast song on the album. Ritual's great. However, I think the best songs are towards the end here. We got, Ritual and Spearhead already, but the songs Dying Creed and especially Celestial Sanctuary are easily the highlights.
Take me far away, deep within the dream. There I can be free from life's misery.
Now, one more cool little thing I want to talk about is that there's a song at the end of the album called Through the Ages, which is just a long outro. And you know what? I'm okay with this. I hate little instrumental songs, but this is how you do an outro, or an intro for that matter anyways. It's kind of the same riff droning on, but you have one of the band members reading through like a long list of huge conflicts that have come through history, huge wars, the death tolls, and all that crazy stuff. I would say probably of all their albums, this is probably the one you should start with. It is by far the most accessible. And thus begins the lengthy era of Bolt Thrower, where every album is basically the same damn thing, which is not a bad thing in this case. But in 1994, we get the follow-up to Chapter 4, which is Chapter 4 Part 2, For Victory Part 1. Now, just like Chapter 4, I'd actually recommend checking out this one to start with as well. If you can't get behind that production of Chapter 4, it sounds like a really bad Scott Burns production, try out this one, because this is basically that album, but a little bit more energized right off the bat. And the production is fucking excellent. I adore the sound of this album. This is how you produce a death metal album to sound modern without making it sound fucking terrible like Nile or something like that. But boy, do I love this album. I have a fucking shirt for this album. The artwork is so simplistic but awesome, because during this time the Persian Gulf War was going on, and they were totally whacking their cacks to that shit, because this band is obsessed with conflict. This is probably my favorite Carl Willett's vocal performance, and this album has a lot of my absolute favorite songs and favorite riffs from the band. It starts with one of the coolest album intros ever that I actually think was worth a damn putting it as an intro, called War. Wow, what an excellently creatively titled song, guys. But then we get to Remembrance, where it's like, holy fuck! It's like someone just kicked you in the fucking ovaries. And it just does not let up. It keeps hitting you and hitting you and hitting you and hitting you until you can no longer have children. But then we come full stop on a song For Victory, which is the title track, of course. A song that's a slow groove. And boy, is this one of my favorite songs.
Daylight returns, the fires of hope still burn, along with dark lights, sitting by the mournful side.
And just like every song on this album and almost every song after this point, this band really capitalizes off of making every song and every riff has some sort of Middle Eastern Phrygian riff or guitar solo. There's only one song I'm not that crazy about called Graven Image. It's kind of a filler, but it's fast and it's exciting, so it's not that big of a deal. And two more of my favorite songs, however, lie at the end of the album. We have Tank Mark 1, which is crazy riffage. But when you thought, wow, that was a great song, I can't get any better. Holy fuck, Armageddon Bound. God damn, that riff is insane. Making this my absolute favorite Bolt Thrower song ever. Now, even though Bolt Thrower to me are my baby, I consider them perfect. There is one album that if they were to get criticized, people will say this one is... It's hard for me to say this, but some people actually will say that this one's a shit album. But after Carl Willits left and then came back, and Andrew Whale left drum duties to be replaced by Alex Thomas, the band released their most polarizing album, surprisingly, even though they shouldn't have any polarizing albums. Now, the one thing I will agree about this album is that the production's kind of shitty. This is around the time they signed to Metal Blade, and the drums sound very weak. The vocals are produced alright. The guitars are really loud. There's no bass, though, so it sounds a little clunky for a death metal production. But it still sounds like old school death metal, and the songs are still very, very, very good. Although I would agree this is probably their weakest album, it's not far off, and I absolutely enjoy the shit out of listening to this. In fact, this one is another one I'd recommend. Maybe start here. This is supposed to be their worst album. If you like this a lot, then you're going to find nothing but incredible shit from this point on and this point before. We're having a more of a cool pace, especially with the starting song Zeroed. Then right away, right after that, you get hammered with what I consider one of their best songs. A song that has incredibly memorable riffs laid to waste. Even though this album is considered one of their weaker ones and probably the least favorite amongst the fan base, everyone cannot deny that the song No Guts, No Glory is by far the standout and one of their best songs easily. But right when we were loving the shit out of having Carl Willits back to do vocal duties, we'd lose him again. And Bolt Thrower followed up Mercenary with another one of their most polarizing albums. An album that recruited two new members, Martin Kearns as the new drummer from this point on, and a very underrated vocalist that I've grown to absolutely love, and you're going to have to love if you're going to like this album. An album that has literally 3 title tracks. Yeah, I shit you not, this album has 3 title tracks. All of them kind of have a bit of the same feel. They're all more of a slow-paced groove, which you'd think could kind of get redundant, especially consider the song Honor, which is the first of the 3 title tracks, is probably the weakest of the 3, and it's kind of a little bit more boring. But then when you hear Valour and Pride, you're like, God damn, these are some of the best songs of the whole fucking album, some of the best they've ever written. Even though this is another one in the fucking pentalogy of Bolt Thrower albums that all sound the goddamn same, this one still sounds a little fresh with Dave Ingram on vocals and a production that I find to be a lot better than Mercenary. It's a lot of old, but it's still a lot of good of old, and my favorite song in here is the second one, Inside the Wire, which has a very crazy, typical classic Bolt Thrower groove and finesse to it. But even though Dave Ingram is fucking awesome and he does a great job on this album, there's nothing wrong with what he did. If we're going to be honest with ourselves, Carl Willits was the better vocalist. 4 years later, in 2005, Bolt Thrower would release, at this moment, their final album. Another incredible album. and an amazing way to end a perfect discography. An album that brings back Carl Willits. An album that's considered a complete and utter comeback album. An album that's considered one of their best albums. A modern death metal album that has an incredible production and some of their absolute best songs. Well, goddamn, I basically just told you everything about the album in the intro. Well, at least now we have more time to talk about the songs, though. We have At First Light, which feels like a total throwback to the beginning of For Victory, which reminds me that this album actually sounds a lot like For Victory Part 2. The energy is back in full swing, and the songwriting is a little bit more experimental. Only slightly, though. I mean, we are talking about Bolt Thrower. And some of the experimental stuff is being shown off on the title track. One of their most different sounding songs, which is Those Once Loyal. Then we get a barrage of amazing songs. The Kill Chain, which is a slow, incredible fucking groove. Anti-Tank Dead Armor is a classic. Then you kind of get two fillers towards the end of the album, Last Stand of Humanity and Salvo. But then it hits you with by far the best song on the album and one of their best songs. A song that's a perfect way to end a sensational discography. We have When Cannons Fade. It's sad that this is their last album. They can't keep making amazing albums, but I'd rather a band do a bunch of really good albums and then know that it's time to stop. That way you can look back at that band and be like, yeah, they had a fucking flawless legacy. You don't want to be the Big Four, which is a cesspool of men going through midlife crisis thinking they're fucking Brett Favre or some shit. Just fucking stop! But this wasn't meant to be the end. They kept trying to write new music for years and years and years. But last year, instead of writing a new album for 11 straight years or taking the opportunity to do something other than touring, the band's drummer Martin Kearns died. And Carl Willits has expressed that he does not want to reunite Bolt Thrower and that this is the end. However, never can sometimes mean ever. And even though this statement makes no fucking sense whatsoever, the band has recently hinted at possibly coming back to do another album. Making statements that they were sad that they weren't able to show off more of Martin's abilities. They said that there's more to come to rectify the fact that they weren't able to show him off more. Does that mean they're actually going to release an album that he performed on? Are they going to dig up those recordings that they felt were not good enough and release it as an album? If that's the case, I would want to hear more of Martin, of course, but I wouldn't want a, shitty album. But I'm a little skeptical about if it's going to be a quality death metal release or not. Well, I guess we'll have to wait and see. And if that day comes, I'm going to amend this video right here, ladies and gentlemen, to review their new album. But I guess if that never happens, and you're just hearing me ramble about nonsensical shit right now at this very second, that means that it never happened. But maybe that was for the best. Before I finish talking about one of my favorite bands ever and having a hell of a time talking about them, I'm going to rank their albums worst to best. Now, disclaimer, let me preface this by saying that this is very, very hard for me to rank their albums. And honestly, you could really put them on any order as long as Mercenary is probably at the bottom. And you have Chapter 4 and For Victory and all of their albums at the top. It doesn't matter. They're all awesome. Probably start with For Victory and Chapter 4. Goodbye.